America 250, The Dogs, Episode 6, A Nation Divided. Welcome to America 250, The Dogs. By the early 19th century, America was no longer trying to find itself. It was becoming something powerful, expanding, growing, moving outward in every direction. But growth doesn't always bring unity. As the map filled in, something else began taking shape. Division. Not over land, but over identity, over economy, over ways of life, over what the nation was and what it would become. And just as they had during every chapter of American history, dogs were there. Not on one side or the other, but beside the people as the country slowly began to tear itself apart. After 1820, the pace of American growth did not slow. It accelerated. New states entered the Union. Frontiers pushed farther west. Settlements became towns. Towns became cities. But the nation wasn't growing in a single direction. It was growing in two. In the North, industry began to reshape daily life. Factories appeared. Railroads expanded. Cities grew larger and more crowded. Work became increasingly structured and mechanical. Life moved at a different pace. In the South, the land remained central. Agriculture dominated. Plantations stretched across the landscape. Open space defined daily life. The economy remained tied to the soil. Two regions, two economies, two identities, and with them came two very different experiences for dogs. In northern cities, dogs adapted to tighter spaces and urban problems. Terriers became invaluable, small, fast, fearless, relentless rat hunters. They controlled rodent populations in factories, warehouses, and crowded neighborhoods. Some of the dogs working in these environments would eventually contribute to breeds such as the Boston Terrier. They were still working dogs, still useful, but their world looked very different from that of their very rural cousins. In the South, dogs remained closely connected to the land. Hounds tracked game across miles of forest and farmland. The lines that would eventually become American foxhounds and coonhounds continued to develop. Alongside them worked larger, more powerful dogs used for guarding property and enforcing control. Dogs bred not simply for hunting, but for authority, for presence, for intimidation. As the nation divided, the lives of dogs reflected that division. Yet despite the differences, one thing remained remarkably familiar. The names. Simple names. Everyday names. Names called across fields and shouted down city streets. Jack, Rex, Duke, Brutus, Sam, Molly, Sally, Lucy, Rose, Belle. Not names destined for history books, just names spoken by families who loved the dogs that answered to them. Because dogs weren't shaping the nation, they were reflecting it. And as America pulled in two directions, they went with it. As the country moved closer to war, dogs became increasingly woven into daily life. But daily life looked different depending on where you lived. Most dogs still ate whatever the household could spare. Table scraps, bones, leftover meat, cornmeal. On farms, many supplemented their diets through hunting. Rabbits, squirrels, birds, whatever they could catch. Commercial dog food did not exist. There were no carefully measured portions, no feeding charts. A dog ate what was available, and sometimes that wasn't much. Where a dog slept depended on where it lived. In rural America, most dogs still lived outdoors, on porches, in yards, near barns, close enough to protect the household, but not necessarily inside it, especially if they were working dogs. Yet that was beginning to change. In growing towns and cities, more dogs were coming indoors, sleeping near fireplaces, curled up on rugs, resting at the foot of a bed. The shift wasn't universal, and it wasn't immediate, but it had begun. The dog was moving closer to the family. Veterinary care remained primitive. Modern veterinary clinics did not yet exist. There were no standardized treatments, no vaccines, no modern surgical procedures. When a dog was injured, care usually came from the owner or from knowledge borrowed from treating livestock. Wounds were cleaned as best they could be. Remedies were improvised. Success often depended on resilience and luck. Even collars remained practical rather than decorative. Most were handmade from leather, simple, durable, functional. Some dogs wore identification, but most did not. A dog was often recognized simply because people knew whose dog it was. Leashes existed, but they were still far less common than they are today. Dogs followed their owners, stayed close to home, or they roamed freely, and that freedom increasingly created tension. As towns grew, concerns grew with them. Concerns about safety, about control, about disease. Rabies remained one of the greatest fears. More people meant more opportunities for exposure, more opportunities for panic. Communities responded with regulations. Dogs running loose, dogs considered dangerous, dogs without clear ownership, all increasingly subject to laws, fines, restrictions, and sometimes destruction. The pattern looked familiar. Freedom, then regulation, movement, then control. Yet through every change, the dog remained where it had always been, at the edge of the home, or just inside it, eating what was available, sleeping where it could, working when needed, not separate from human life, but woven directly into it. In 1861, the divide finally broke. Not through debate, not through legislation, but through war. North against South, brother against brother. Everything that I once felt stable began to unravel. Homes emptied, fields were abandoned, communities were disrupted, and through it all, dogs remained. They did not choose sides, but they followed the people who did. Dogs appeared in Union camps. Dogs appeared in Confederate camps. Not as soldiers, but often as something just as important. They guarded camp at night, alerted men to movement in the darkness, following marching columns for miles, adapted to lives built around tents, campfires, smoke, and constant movement. Some became mascots, adopted by entire regiments, fed when food could be spared, given names, given affection, a small piece of familiarity in a world that no longer felt familiar. Others existed on the edges, camp followers, unclaimed dogs moving between wagons, supply trains, and soldiers, surviving the only way they knew how. On battlefields, dogs were present as well, not standing in formation, not carrying weapons, but there nonetheless, moving through chaos, through noise, through confusion, through fear, and when battles ended, many remained, with the wounded, with the dying, sometimes even with the dead, because dogs didn't understand politics. They didn't understand secession. They didn't understand strategy. They understood people, and that never changed. In a nation tearing itself apart, dogs became something more than workers or guards. They became anchors, living reminders of home, of normalcy, of loyalty, of something steady in a world that no longer was, because even in war, they stayed close. When the Civil War ended, the United States was still standing, but it was not the same country that had entered the conflict. Cities had grown, land had changed hands, families had been divided, and countless lives had been lost. The nation survived, but it had been transformed, and throughout that transformation, dogs remained, on farms, in cities, in military camps, on battlefields, not choosing sides, not understanding the conflict, but staying beside the people who lived through it, adapting as they always had, because no matter how dramatically the country changed, one thing endured: the bond between people and dogs. And in the next chapter of our story, we'll move deeper into the Civil War itself, not through generals or battles, but through the lives of the dogs who were there, named, remembered, and recorded. Thank you for listening to America 250, The Dogs. Join me next time as we follow the stories of the dogs who experienced the Civil War firsthand, because as this nation fought to hold itself together, it never did so alone, because then, as now, we were a pack. I'm Andrea LaGrow, and I'll see you next time.